Hi, I'm Patrick with the Starlings One podcast. Today we put together a number of different sources, which you can find in the description, that talk about the evolution that DaimlerChrysler went through from the 1980s through the 1990s and onward as the automotive industry became increasingly complex in terms of both the supply side and the number of options that could be offered to a customer, and the demand side in terms of all the different kinds of complex vehicles that the market started to demand on a global scale. What happened was in the 80s and previous, DaimlerChrysler had to do kind of the best they could in terms of forecasting. They had to look at raw sales numbers and try to figure out and work backwards towards what kind of purchasing they needed to do. As the automotive industry became more complex, and obviously as machine learning methodologies also emerged and computing emerged, they adopted more of an evidence-based approach and a more complex forecasting approach. And there's nothing really groundbreaking here. It's not an academic study. None of these are academic studies. They're all just sort of from industry rags. But it's important, I think, to look at the history and realize that a lot of industries, like DaimlerChrysler, have gone through this transition. And we used to live in a world where forecasting just wasn't as complex. It wasn't as dialed in. And it was a lot more based on ranks and lists. And we've transitioned from that kind of era into an era where we're really looking at the details, and we're really using a lot of different tools to figure out what kinds of decisions should be made. So I thought that'd be interesting to cover. Thanks very much for being here. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy it. Oh, hey, and I almost forgot. Jump on over to starlings.one for more information. Check out all of our different socials. And you can also check out our completely open source and MIT licensed prediction market called Social Predict. If you just search Social Predict on GitHub or just Google or whatever way you want to find it online. You know how to find things. Just search Social Predict, prediction market. All right, great. Thanks. Enjoy the episode.
Buckle up, everybody. We're going deep on car customization today. Back in the 90s, Mercedes-Benz had a challenge.
Oh, yeah.
Figuring out what customers would want on their rides.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got some great sources to dig into this.
Okay.
An academic paper, a Dataiku case study, an article all about algorithmic forecasting,
Wow.
and a magazine piece about Daimler working with Flexus AG.
All right.
So picture this. 400 options.
Wow, that's a lot.
100 models.
Okay.
Sold in 250 countries.
Yeah.
It's like a customization dream come true, but also a total forecasting nightmare, right?
For sure.
I mean, how do you even start predicting demand with that much variety?
Well, what's really interesting is that Mercedes was already dealing with all these choices way back then.
There is.
It was like an explosion of options, tons of data.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. The real problem was the lack of data for each specific combo,
Right.
car, option, and which country it's going to.
Mm-hmm.
The paper actually says that on average, only 1.4 cars made were identical. Yeah.
That's crazy. So how'd they handle forecasting with that level of variation?
Right.
Did they just tell the production team good luck?
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
At first, they looked at the total sales of each option. How many automatic transmissions were sold each month, that sort of thing.
Seems logical.
Yeah, it seemed like the obvious place to start, but it turned out to be way too simple.
Interesting. So they started simple, but it backfired.
It did.
So why didn't that work?
Well, the data was all over the place. Production shifted between models and countries, so there were all these ups and downs that didn't really show what customers truly wanted.
So the bigger picture wasn't really helpful.
It was misleading.
Yeah, I get it.
It's like, imagine trying to figure out how popular pepperoni is on pizza just by looking at the total pepperoni sales.
Right.
You wouldn't know if people in your neighborhood loved it or if there was like a pepperoni-only sale happening somewhere else.
Makes sense. So they needed a more focused approach.
Exactly.
To really see what customers preferred.
Yeah.
So what did they do?
They realized preferences were pretty consistent within specific models and countries.
Oh.
So instead of looking at like total sunroof sales,
right,
they shifted to, say, what percentage of C-Class cars sold in Germany had sunroofs?
Gotcha. So they got way more granular.
Much more.
Zooming in on models and countries, that seems like a big shift.
Oh, it was crucial.
Did that solve all their problems, though?
It definitely helped.
Okay.
But even then, the traditional forecasting methods like AREMA modeling,
Right.
they took too long.
Oh, no.
And honestly, they weren't always more accurate than simpler methods, especially with all that data.
Wow. So even with a better approach, the data was still a problem.
It was massive.
What did they try next? Just brute force it with more computing power?
They had a better idea.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Instead of just one method, they came up with a multi-strategy approach.
Multi-strategy, what's that?
They combined a bunch of different techniques
Oh.
and picked the best ones for each set of data based on its quirks like trends and seasonal patterns and stuff.
Clever, but what were the methods back then? Was AI even a thing in the 90s?
Not like today, but they were pretty ahead of the curve.
Okay.
They used something called a decision tree, created by a machine learning algorithm.
Wow, a decision tree back then. That's impressive.
It was.
So they were letting an algorithm choose the best way to forecast.
Basically, yeah.
I'm really curious what kind of methods were in the running.
They looked at everything from basic ones like moving averages
Uh-huh.
to more complex ones like that AREMA modeling.
Right, right.
The decision tree was like a smart filter guiding them to the best fit.
So they mixed and matched. Simple when it worked,
Basically.
complex when they had to, a very practical approach.
It was.
But I'm guessing Mercedes didn't stop there.
You know, Mercedes, always pushing the boundaries.
Yo, what was next?
They took it a step further, combining the results from all those different methods.
Wait, so they got a bunch of predictions and then
Yeah, they combined them into one single final prediction.
like a forecasting team huddle?
You got it.
How'd they decide the best way to combine them, though?
Another decision tree.
Wow. 2 decision trees.
They used it to figure out the best way to mix the predictions.
So sometimes simple averages,
Sometimes.
sometimes more complex stuff,
Oh,
and
all right.
even neural networks in the 90s.
They were pioneers. And it worked. This multi-strategy approach was way better than their old method.
That's incredible. They solved a really complex problem by being smart about the data and using some cutting-edge tech.
It was pretty remarkable.
But this was just the beginning, right? Their forecasting journey didn't end there.
You're absolutely right.
So what happened next?
Well, let's talk about that in part 2. This was just the start for Daimler, really.
Oh, so they kept going with this forecasting.
Oh yeah, big time.
Okay, so what happened next? Did they stick with the same system or switch to something totally new?
They took all that expertise, all the smarts they built into their forecasting system, and they turned it into software.
Software, like a forecasting program anyone could use.
Exactly. They called it Merlin.
Merlin, the wizard.
Right. It let people across the company use these powerful algorithms without needing to be data scientists themselves.
So they made it user-friendly, basically.
It was a game changer. More people could make data-driven decisions.
I bet that had a ripple effect beyond just Daimler.
Oh, for sure.
Companies always try to stay ahead of the curve. Right.
Absolutely. And Daimler's approach really showed a trend that was happening across industries.
Like what?
Well, for example, Uber did something similar with their Michelangelo solution.
Michelangelo for forecasting.
Yeah, they were using automation to improve their operations, too.
Makes sense. Every company needs to predict and adapt.
Right.
But let's get back to Daimler.
Okay.
We've talked about how they forecasted demand, but they also needed to make sure they could actually build all those custom cars.
Good point.
So how did they make sure production kept up with those predictions?
That's where the magazine article about Daimler's work with Flexus AG comes in.
Okay, what did they do together?
They created a system called BEST.
Best. Okay, what did it do?
Remember how Mercedes needed to make sure they had all the right parts to build each unique car?
Yeah, with so many options, it must have been a logistical nightmare.
BEST helped with exactly that.
So Best focused on the parts side of things.
Exactly.
How did it work? Did it just send alerts to suppliers when they needed more sunroof motors or something?
It was more sophisticated than that.
Okay, I'm all ears.
It helped them figure out how many parts they'd need even before they had specific customer orders.
So they could anticipate demand?
Think of it like predicting pizza ingredients based on general trends, even before anyone actually orders a pizza.
I like where this is going.
It's about being prepared, having the right ingredients on hand.
So Best helped them bridge the gap between predicted sales and actual production.
And avoid bottlenecks.
It's like a forecasting safety net.
Exactly. It helped them balance all those customization options with the realities of making the cars.
That's impressive, but Daimler didn't stop there, did they?
Never. They were always looking ahead.
What do you mean?
The technology forecasting in the automotive sector article, Talks about how they tried to understand the future of the industry.
The future, huh? Were they using crystal balls?
Not quite, but they were pretty good at predicting some major changes.
Like what?
Well, one thing they did was patent analysis.
Patent analysis, so they were looking at new inventions.
Yeah, they tracked the development of new technologies.
Looking for clues about where things were headed.
Exactly. They were looking for patterns that might signal future opportunities.
Smart. Did they just focus on car-related patents?
They were smarter than that.
Oh.
They looked at patents from other industries, too.
Why other industries?
Because innovation often happens at the intersection of different fields.
Ah, so advancements in, say, materials science could have implications for cars.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots.
So they were thinking outside the box, avoiding tunnel vision.
That's a good way to put it.
What other methods did they use?
Well, they understood that innovation is a social process. It's not just about ideas, it's about people.
Right.
So they used something called social network analysis.
Okay, what's that?
They mapped out the connections between innovators, researchers, industry experts.
Like a who's who of the automotive world.
Yeah, and it helped them identify key players and emerging trends within these networks.
So they could see where the energy was flowing?
Exactly.
It's like they were attending all the coolest conferences, but digitally.
Huh. That's a great way to think about it.
But they didn't stop at social networks, did they?
They also dove into academic research. They used bibliometrics to track trends and identify new areas of knowledge.
Bibliometrics, so they were reading all those dense research papers, looking for clues about the future.
Well, not necessarily reading every single one themselves, but they used tools to analyze all that information.
So they had a digital research assistant.
Something like that.
But how did they put all this information together? Did they have some grand unified model?
It wasn't just about plugging numbers into a model. It was about using those insights to inform their strategy.
Their strategy, you mean like how they planned for the future?
Exactly. It influenced their product development, their investment priorities, everything.
So they used all this research to make decisions.
And it led them to their CASE strategy.
CASE?
Connected, autonomous, shared, electric.
Oh, right, CASE. Everyone's talking about CASE these days.
But Daimler was ahead of the curve. They understood how these emerging technologies would reshape the industry.
So their research helped them create this roadmap for the future.
It showed them the rising demand for electric vehicles, autonomous driving, all that.
It's like they were looking beyond just selling cars. They were thinking about the future of mobility.
Exactly. They understood that the car was just one piece of the puzzle.
This is fascinating stuff, but let's bring it back to our listener for a second.
Good idea.
We've talked a lot about high-level stuff.
We have.
But what can our listener actually take away from all this? What's the practical advice here?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons is that forecasting is not a one-time thing.
It's a process.
It's about being willing to adapt, to use new technologies, and to always be refining your methods.
Be a forecasting chameleon, always changing with the environment.
I like that.
What else can our listener learn from all this?
Be curious. Don't just stick to the usual sources of information. Look for insights in unexpected places.
Be a knowledge detective. I love it.
Talk to people outside your usual circle, get different perspectives.
That's great advice.
And remember, the future isn't set in stone. We create it through our choices.
So we all have a role to play in shaping what's to come.
Exactly.
That's a great note to end on, but before we get too philosophical,
Right.
let's shift gears a bit in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, what are we looking at next?
We'll be looking at how the political scene back in the 90s, trade agreements, environmental stuff, all of that, how it impacted car manufacturing.
Right. It wasn't just about what customers wanted.
Mercedes had to deal with all these policies and global trends, too.
For sure, the 90s were a wild time for the car industry.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those political currents.
Right.
What were the big issues back then? Was it all about seatbelts and airbags? Or was there more to it?
Safety was definitely a big thing.
Yeah.
Airbags, anti-lock brakes, they were becoming more common.
Right.
But there were these bigger forces at play, too.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest was climate change.
Oh, yeah, that was starting to become a big deal.
People were becoming more aware of the environmental impact of cars.
Makes sense.
And governments started putting in stricter emissions standards.
So how did those stricter standards affect a company like Mercedes?
Known for their powerful engines.
Exactly. Did they have to make some tough choices?
Absolutely. They had to find a balance.
Yeah.
Their brand image, built on performance. and the need to meet these new environmental rules.
It's like they were trying to make a race car that sips fuel like a tiny scooter.
It was a tough challenge for sure.
Were there other political challenges besides the environmental stuff?
Trade policies were a big one, too.
Oh, right. The 90s saw a lot of globalization.
Companies were expanding all over the place.
And new trade agreements.
And new tensions, too.
Mercedes couldn't just focus on Germany anymore.
Nope. They had to think globally.
So how did they adjust their forecasting to account for all that?
Did they have, like, political analysts on their team or something?
Right.
Well, not exactly, but they definitely needed to understand the political landscape better.
They couldn't just rely on old trends.
Exactly. They had to consider how government policies, trade agreements, even public opinion might affect demand.
So if they were forecasting a big demand for SUVs, they also had to think about things like fuel economy standards or if people might suddenly want smaller cars.
You got it. It added a whole new level of complexity to their forecasting.
They couldn't just look at the numbers.
They had to understand the bigger picture, the political context.
It sounds like forecasting was becoming less about predicting the future.
And more about navigating uncertainty.
So how did Mercedes stay ahead of the game in such a crazy environment?
By being adaptable.
Adaptable.
Yeah, always learning.
Okay.
They kept refining their methods, using new data, and questioning their own assumptions.
They knew that in a world that's constantly changing, the only constant is change itself.
That's a good way to put it.
That's a great takeaway for anyone, no matter what industry they're in.
For sure.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
They have.
From forecasting car options
To technological change.
to political shifts.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But what does it all mean for our listener?
Good question.
What are the key takeaways they can use in their own lives?
Well, I think we've seen that forecasting isn't just about crunching numbers.
It's about more than that.
It's about understanding all the different things that shape the future.
Right, all those complex factors.
And it's about being open to new technologies and new ideas.
Be a knowledge detective, a forecasting chameleon, always adapting.
Exactly. And most importantly, remember that the future isn't set in stone.
We have the power to shape it.
Through the choices we make.
That's inspiring. So go out there, embrace the challenge of forecasting.
And don't be afraid to question everything.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating exploration.
I've enjoyed it.
We hope you've learned something new and are ready to tackle the future head on.